This film is strictly for educational purposes only.
It is interesting to me that under our Constitution and otherwise, that we compensate people if we take their property. Shouldn't we compensate people if they were property sanctioned by the state? Sanctioned by the state? Sanctioned by the state? So I believe that is a conversation that's worth having. And I see that as right and wrong. I don't see that as political or non-political.
Nobody alive today in 2019 was a slave back then. So what are we getting paid for? Who's getting paid? Why are they getting paid? It's no more than a campaign promise from Democratic hopefuls trying to get some kind of attention out here.
ABL. Listen, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. They provide economic restitution to those people. Now, if I came into your house, Mr. ABL, and I stole $1,000 from you and then I died, or if I stole $1 million from you and then I died, would you say, oh, well, Reese died, so the money doesn't matter anymore? No, you would go talk to my children because my children are still living off the benefits of that $1 million.
Just because somebody's granddad stole something doesn't mean I'm responsible for it. If somebody's granddad was a serial killer and then they found out 100 years later, you don't go after the kids and say, okay, you got to go to jail now, or you got to pay back some money because of what your grandfather did. It makes no sense. You know who did it. You should have been able to catch them while they were alive, punish them while they were alive.
We want to focus on is the economic harm that was done to black people. If we really break down what slavery was, people were brought from across the water to work, and that was free labor. So what we have is generations and years, hundreds of years of systematic discrimination and shutting out of economic access to black people, and that has to be repaid.
If we're going to blame the government of the USA, even though nobody is alive wait a minute, even though nobody's alive right now, 2019, that was alive back then, and then the thing about it is, who's going to pay it? You're talking about the government. The government is funded by the people. That means me, that means you will pay for it. So how does it make any sense? Like I said, it would have been more reasonable to have the former slave owner pay the slave when reparations would have been due, which is at the end of slavery, not right now. It makes no sense. This whole argument, it's no logic here.
America's never even studied the effects of slavery on black people. They've never sat down and said, we know that as a government we sanction this experience, but we don't even know how far that experience reaches because no one's ever studied it. How much do we owe black people? No one's ever studied it. Why? Because the government has literally buried its head. It's paid out everybody else and turned its back on the black people in America who have given so much to want to just strive to be a part of this country, and with their blood, sweat, and tears.
They paid the money when it was due,
whether it's 150 years. That's irrelevant. The point is the effects are still there. How long are we going to continue this narrative?
200 years, 300 years, 5,000 years? How long are we going to continue the narrative? At what point do we say we're past slavery?
We're going to stop it now because the buck stops here. Hopefully my generation will stand up and say that the buck stops here, so we don't have to go on with this any longer.
I know that there's a lot of disagreement, both about whether it should be done and if it were done, how it would be done. You know, I'm not naive about that. But I do think that dark cloud still hangs over our country. I believe that we ought to move forward in the 21st century as one nation with one destiny, and that until that issue is resolved, until that original sin is addressed, we may think that we're moving forward as one nation, and I don't think that we ever really will.
Because we're entering the age of AI, we're going to have self-driving cars and trucks in 5 to 10 years. 30% of malls are going to close in the next 4 years thanks to Amazon. 2.5 million call center workers in the U.S. are going to get replaced by AI. There was a study in The Guardian that said the median African-American household net worth is going to be 0 by 2053, like in 34 years. You guys see that study?
No.
Well, yeah, you should look it up. And so why are they forecasting that African-American net worth is going to go to zero? It's because of this economic tidal wave that is coming. This economic tidal wave is going to wipe out many working class jobs. And it's going to be the equivalent of a natural disaster. And we know what happens in a natural disaster. Who suffers? Poor people who don't have the resources, people of color.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. It's two Latin words, ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
Throughout today's society of America, people are suffering from a variety of distractions that are placed in the forefront of the public's eye in order to maintain a particular degree of division amongst themselves. And when it comes to the history of slavery in America, some may feel as though slavery was abolished in 1865, when it was merely upgraded and transitioned into what it is known today as, which is employment. The industrialized version of what President Woodrow Wilson and his administration, along with multiple other co-conspirators like Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and the University of Chicago, just to name a few, created and enacted into law for the benefit of 1% of the people. And their social engineering experiment also included control over things that would affect one's mindset, controlling what is known as American history, religion, science, social media, and public education. In 1909, in front of a large set group of law advisors and educators, President Woodrow Wilson was quoted stating the following: "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific difficult manual tasks." End quote. In other words, compulsory educational institutions, which does not exclude colleges and universities, were handed down particular curriculums that taught its students how to become industrial providers that will benefit already existing companies of the open market throughout America's capitalist society, while the other class will be provided a much higher quality education, to say the least, allowing its students to think freely and become innovators in having control. Making excellence inclusive rather than inclusive will require revolutionary change, not just in our practices, but also in our mindsets. Dr. Carl Snyder. Now, since you have been made cognizant of how a liberal education was designed for only 1% of the people, that should make you question everything that you were ever taught in school, even if you earned a doctrine or any form of degree for that matter. Because it's not about you being taught the best education possible when you were being taught lies as your education to begin with. It's now beyond black and white issues. It's what's wrong and right issues. For example, over the years, the descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of Turtle Island, or rather the people that are falsely misclassified as African Americans today, are owed a lot more than just a form of reparations, and those who feel as though they should be paid for their direct ancestors' involvement with the creation and industrialization of the United States of America should be paid. However, just a simple check or lump sum of money given by those who benefited from our ancestors' labor to make amends for the now over 240 years of hereditary damage this capitalist society indulged upon our ancestors does not, in fact, resolve the overall issue. And here's why. Let's take the definition of reparations, for example, the one which is heavily highlighted to the public, stating that reparations is an act of making amends or giving satisfaction for wrongdoing, maybe in a form of payment for damages. But let's look at another definition for reparations, which is an act of repairing or keeping in repair. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Sort of like when you take your car to a mechanic who has plans to fix the initial problem with your car, but somehow more damage is done, so that at a later time you are sure to return to continuously allow that same bad mechanic to work on your car unknowingly. Or I'll give you another example. It's like when you visit your doctor and he or she prescribes you a pill that allegedly cures one problem, but yet it somehow exposes you to several more. This is the problem with reparations. It does not fix the problem. It just covers it up for a certain time period, and yet the problem still persists. Because in order to fix a problem, we must begin at the root of a problem. This is why it is critically important for our people to know the truth about our past in order to see exactly where the problem began. In my previous documentary called The Untold Truth About Reparations, ADOS, and Slavery in America, I shared detailed information about the Civil War, why and how it was a labor dispute, and I also mentioned that Abraham Lincoln did not free so-called African-American slaves with the release of the Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95. But what President Lincoln's Proclamation 95 did do, however, was ended the Civil War by quelling the advancement of military troops upon any people or person who did not agree with the United States government. Instead of fighting, it was urged by politicians for people to bring their disputes to Congress, but only through a representative of each state. This is how the United States was established, having learned how to govern the 13 colonies by watching the operations of the previous confederacies our ancestors owned. I will go into more detail about this later on in another segment, but what is important to note here is that in order to restore the Union upon the remaining confederacies that would eventually turn into governments of each state, a set of reparations had to be agreed upon in favor of the copper-colored landowners, sharecroppers, or the Negro farmers, making this one of the main possible reasons why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Now, reparations could have been delayed for the people of color due to a few factors. One, a study has never been conducted by any creditable source in order to discover just how much in a form of payment should the employees between 1776 and now be compensated for their binding contracts of forced labor. 2, there were subdivisions doing business as institutions, agencies, banks, and corporations that history fails to mention who worked as liaisons of the U.S. government, directly involving themselves with funding both sides of the 61 documented wars of the 1800s by creating loopholes and other schemes that forced our ancestors out of their own lands here in America, and also with streamlining the industrialized version of slavery that still exists today. 3, these companies were never held responsible for their actions in a courtroom, which makes it even more reason to reveal who should be held responsible still in order to bridge the gap between justice and equality for the indigenous Aboriginal Niji right now. The majority of bonds that were paid off by employers in order to hire prisoners of war as their new employees were done so by either bartering or loaning contracts out to employers as a form of business credit. This method remains intact still today. A bond is a, quote, promise to repay the principal along with interest on a specific date. Some bonds do not pay interest, but all bonds require a repayment of principal. When an investor buys a bond, he or she becomes a creditor of the issuer, end quote. So since the so-called slave master or rather the employer, becomes the creditor and the so-called slave holder, or rather the issuer of the bond, is the investor, then both parties are not only responsible for funding slavery, but should be held responsible for refunding the so-called slaves. Keep in mind that our ancestors were under the impression that they were not working for free, and that this form of slavery, or blind capitalism, will benefit everyone, especially those who were the majority of the help that literally built America from the ground up, due to promises or contracts that were never upheld by the promising parties. Hence the term indentured servitude. The noun indenture is a, quote, written formal contract for services, a deed with mutual covenants. So, who are these people that should be held responsible for the millions of broken promises, compulsory educational institutions, unpaid laborers, and unpaid military soldiers who fought and died for the uprising of this country, destroyed legacies, cultures, and spiritualities, inequality in workplaces, generational poverty, stolen land allotments, racism, concentration camps turned project housing reserved for only a large median of people of color, identity theft and paper genocide, and many, many years of injustice and discrimination? The answer to this question is very complex and will require me to produce multiple segments surrounding this topic to break it all down. But here's a critical example to make note of. The majority of our people now can recall hearing stories about how their ancestors and even some living elders were former sharecroppers, landowners, or farmers. And the way Hollywood paints the picture of American Indians should make you question why you would rarely see authentic photographs, painted or engraved images of the Hollywood depicted version of American Indians working in the fields anywhere across the southeastern region of North America. So, how would millions of American Indians be able to survive if they didn't know how to farm? And for that matter, when did the American Indians have time to set some time aside to teach millions of so-called enslaved American Negroes how to farm, before these same millions of American Negroes taught the incoming white foreigners from Europe and Africa how to farm? The answer is very simple. The American Indian is the American Negro.
King, you liken these payments to slave reparations, but just factually speaking, how can you say that? These payments are not for anyone descended from slaves. These are payments, they're not even for black farmers who were discriminated against all throughout the 1900s. They're payments specifically for black farmers who the USDA admits were being discriminated against between 1983 and 1997. So how are these slave reparations?
Well, I've sat on the Judiciary Committee for 8 years. I sat through slavery reparation hearings that were held by Chairman John Conyers, and of course through the hearings here on the Pigford Farms claims. And the motivation that comes from this looks to me like there's no resistance on the part of the proponents to hold back or look for fraud in this. They just simply seem to be content with every black farmer that would apply would get what was defined as Judge Friedman and in his opinion as virtually an automatic payment.
Dr. Boyd, let me just ask you specifically, though, staying on this topic. I mean, Representative King has talked about a hypothetical Johnny who was born on a farm but, quote, went off to the city, became a drug addict, and now wants the $50,000 that comes from the USDA under this claim. How strict is the vetting of these claims?
Well, first of all, I think that that statement has a terrible, terrible racial undertone and very, very offensive to our black farmers. And we need to forget here, we help feed the country. We help feed the world. And we paid our price to be in this country and to own land. And what the government done to black farmers is wrong. How strict is the vetting? I mean, Representative King is saying just about anybody who's African American can claim to have been a farmer. So how strict is it? The consent decree says African Americans who farmed or attempted to farm between 1981 and 1997. And the reason we use that definition is because the Civil Rights Office at USDA was closed under the Reagan administration. And we went in and found and investigated and found thousands of black farmer civil rights cases that had never been processed. And that's what this case is about. This case is not about fraud. This case is about bringing justice and equality and fairness to a group of people who deserve it. And it's long overdue justice.
Congressman King, it is pretty shocking when you start to look into what happened in the USDA. I mean, they were literally throwing out discrimination claims, just dumping them in the garbage in some cases. You claim 75% of the claims now being made in this program by African-American farmers have been fraudulent. You say an unnamed person working for the USDA gave you that estimate. USDA says that percentage is complete nonsense. The FBI has investigated, they say, found only 3 cases of fraud. Where's the proof of this 75% claim you made?
Well, and John Boyd says that there's no fraud. The FBI or the USDA has reported that the FBI came up with 3 cases that they prosecuted. Now, what is the level of fraud here? I've said that I had a district director who was deployed to Washington, D.C. to help administer the distribution of the first $1.05 billion under Pigford. He came back, he among others, with stacks of copies of the documents, sick at heart, and he said at least 75% are fraudulent. And so we can't say that there's no fraud here. Here's what we know. Judge Friedman put in his decision, he wrote 40 acres and a mule in his decision. So I'm not making this part up about reparations. That is the words. That's the code words for reparations.
Wait a minute, sir. I've read that decision, and he just Sir, I've read that decision, and he just used that in a recitation about the history of the interaction between African Americans and the U.S. government and the USDA. He wasn't equating 40 acres and a mule to this program.
Well, and also
let me say, though, Anderson, that he laments that he can't fix all the wrongs of slavery and segregation in one civil rights case. Now he's got a second one.
Mr. King,
I want Dr. Boyd to be able to respond. Dr. Boyd?
Let me talk here. The farmers deserve this restitution. It's long overdue for the black farmers. This is not a rush to judgment. Mr. King has known about this issue. I have testified before him many times before. And this case is about African-American farmers who farmed or attempted to farm, who was discriminated against by the United States Department of Agriculture. And I can tell you about discrimination because I had a county official to spit on me and to tear my application up and throw it in the trash can. And I begged and pleaded with the committee to have that person fired. That person was never fired. He was transferred to another county office to continue to work out his service for the United States Department of Agriculture. And they gave him a big party, a big retirement party. So I can tell you that this discrimination is real, and I invite Mr. King to walk in my shoes and other black farmers' shoes around this country before he pass judgment and refer to him as Johnny or someone that has a drug problem. And I tell you that, Anderson, these farmers have proven their case, and they deserve to have their cases heard based on its merit.
The first document I found was the Aetna slave policy. The Aetna slave policy. The Aetna slave policy. As soon as the story broke in the media, they backed down on the restitution.
The descendants continue to suffer collective sort of problems. They suffer from extraordinary problems in healthcare, in education, in housing, in every facet of life, infant mortality, life expectancy, in all the areas that speak to the quality of life, the descendants continue to suffer.
And what drives you?
Justice. I'd like to see that the truth is told, and that these corporations that committed horrendous acts against my ancestors pay restitution. They should not be able to keep assets they acquired stealing people and stealing labor.
If our ancestors, and they did, created that wealth, then it seems to me, in a very logical way, that their descendants should benefit from that from that wealth, because that wealth having been passed down from generation to generation, companies, foundations, individual families in this nation, it seems to me that those who was directly responsible for creating it, since they did not benefit, notwithstanding the fact that they invested their labor and their lives and all the torture and dehumanizing process that went with slavery, then surely their descendants should, just as the descendants of the wealth on the plantation owners and slave owners, their descendants are still enjoying the wealth. And many companies that came out of the slave period, their economic foundation was based, and stability was based on slave labor and the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. And the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. And the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. And the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves.
Reparations is the moral equivalent of what we're doing. But reparations is, as you know, a resurgent idea on the left. It's suddenly popular. At least one presidential candidate, but two, I think, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, are now calling for reparations. Is that good or bad?
It's the most ridiculous proposal that I ever heard. First of all, it's important to deconstruct it a little bit. Reparations, you know, the question is, who pays and who gets paid? People don't realize that it's slavery. There were blacks who owned slaves as well. There were 3,700 blacks that owned 12,000 slaves. Now, 3 tribes, the Chickasaws tribes, the Creek Indians, they own 3,500 slaves. So the question for me and for the audience should be, well, who pays? Do the sons and daughters of those blacks and Native Americans that own slaves, do their ancestors, do they pay? And so it's a little more complicated than people are making. What about the whites who came here after slavery? What about the hundreds of thousands who died fighting again in a civil war who never owned slaves?
Right.
And so I just think that we ought to take this into consideration when we're talking about slavery. It's also providing exemption from personal responsibility. With all of the problems that Black America has, for someone to say that the answers to those challenges are external. Let's just say we accept the premise that reparations should be paid. What problem does it solve? If whites paid blacks money on Monday and we come back 2 weeks later, what would be the impact on black crime? What would be the impact of drug addiction, about the high dropout rate? And so I just think it's lethal for us to just talk about a simplistic remedy so we can do virtue signaling on the issue of race and appear to be champions. What we have done at the Woodson Center is we believe you should look into the Black America's past and find out how our ancestors achieved against the odds where there was racial inequality and income disparity. We built hospitals, we built schools, we had solid families. And so it is important for us to not to look back, but also to look at what are our strengths. And frankly, Tucker, I'm going to say I think Black America needs to abandon complaining about what happened in the past and begin to address the enemy within. That's the challenge we face today. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our liberators. Right. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our liberators. And we won't do that as long as we're looking to the people we say who are enemies to be our
Continuing where I left off from the first segment, this is where we shed some light amongst the darker areas of America's history and pinpoint the mistakes that were made that are in desperate need of correction. Mind you, in order to fix a problem, you must first begin at the very root of a problem. Otherwise, you are skipping vital information that could lead us into positive changes in the near future. This is why it is very essential to know the truth about your past, because if you allow a stranger to tell you all about your past without any valuable sources of creditable documentation, you will inadvertently misrepresent yourself, and more importantly, misrepresent everything that your direct ancestors died for. So, who are these people that should be held responsible for the millions of broken promises, compulsory educational institutions, unpaid laborers and unpaid military soldiers who fought and died for the uprising of this country, destroyed legacies, cultures, and spiritualities, inequality in workplaces, generational poverty, stolen land allotments, racism, concentration camps turned project housing reserved for only a large median of colored people, identity theft and paper genocide, and many years of injustice and discrimination? The most important persons of value towards this floating debt system would be the victims of sharecropping, the Negro farmers. Agriculture was big business throughout North America, even before the Civil War, and history fails to mention that it was the Negro farmers who were wronged by everyone else involved in the trade of resources and goods. People of today's society of America tends to believe that slavery in America was about some pale-faced foreigner living on a farm or plantation in which he allegedly owned many slaves. And numerous people would suppose that all of those slaves were so-called black people being held in bondage. No, during that time period of the South, the majority of farms were actually owned by people of color, and many of the pale faces known around town were slaving, or rather conducting laborer duties as promised, being as though they were squatters on those farms, which meant that their occupations were to assist the landowners with producing crops and maintaining the farm's livestock, etc. These squatters were later referred to as tenant farmers. This process is known as the system of sharecropping. According to the Webster's Dictionary, sharecropping is defined as a tenant farmer, especially in the southern U.S., who is provided with credit for seed, tools, living quarters, and food, who works the land, and who receives an agreed share of the value of the crop minus charges. End quote. In other words, there was a particular trade relationship between the Negro farmers and the tenant farmers that were now squatting on their lands. And thanks to the likes of public laws like the Preemption Act of 1841, for example, the Negro farmers were unaware that their lands could now be purchased and claimed by the tenant farmers after just 14 months of residence. The Preemption Act of 1841 granted settlers the right to occupy the Negro farmers' lands legally, but fraudulently, and the government, along with many other co-conspirators, even without permission from Negro farmers, changed these lands to read as public lands due to the establishment of the land banks and the farm credit system, in which I'll get into this shortly. As I've mentioned in my previous segment of this topic, slave contracts, or rather indentures of servitude, were created by banks and business owners, and they were sold with floating debt, or rather credit. But how do you take Negro farmers and then turn them into a slave? Well, you introduce them to the idealism of currency. Today, currency is defined as a system of money in general use in a particular country. The word currency derives from the Latin word currere, which means to run. It is a flow of energy which runs and circulates from person to person. This is why trading was introduced. The term trade is a Middle Dutch word from the late 14th century, meaning track or course. And in order to produce currency through trade, one would use their own energy to run that same track or course. This formal practice was conducted amongst most tribes and or nations of people for quite a while. And in order to make a slave, you would first have to slightly alter the process of the said trade system that was initially utilized by adding in a form of currency. An environment for economic behavior was induced upon the trade process, which allowed for the devaluation of the products that were being exchanged. And with this change came a decreasing need for having a great amount of Negro farmers, because any individual could buy from a Negro farmer and sell whatever it is back to the consumers at a higher rate, causing that individual to put whatever price tag they want on that same flow of energy that someone else provided. It's essential to note that this task was very difficult to manifest during much earlier time periods of history across these lands, due to the common use of gold and silver and other things of value that provided a medium of exchange. Originally, there was a bartering system, which allowed for the trade of goods and services in return for other goods and services, but not necessarily being of equal value. And when it comes to the Negro farmers, whatever was needed would have to be purchased directly from the Negro farmer at the farmer's price, due to the pale-faced squatter's lack of knowing how to farm. But with the creation of a credit system and a paper currency, a person could then purchase from the Negro farmer with floating debt, which is credit, and then sell those same crops grown by the Negro farmers to another person at whatever price they choose. This was the birth of what is known as the open market. Any person that takes advantage of this utilitarian method could now also control consumption or depletion, which segues into supply and demand. Note that this was not a quick process of just taking someone's word for a product, crop, or piece of paper. Other forms of currency were set into place first, like silver, gold, and coins, etc., to make purchases and conduct trade for crops and land, because it was seemingly smarter and more convenient to carry a note that somehow held the same value as weight in gold, opposed to actually carrying around a large bag of gold. Shortly thereafter, instead of holding onto large surpluses of crops for trade, people began to do business under promises, literally, deciding to trade in their valuable commodities for promissory notes, making this the biggest mistake ever made in U.S. history without any exaggeration. Multiple promissory notes were circulating during this time period, but they were known around town as greenbacks, then officially became known later on as legal tender notes. This is what began the circulation of a paper currency here in the U.S. In the year 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, which not only allowed for the finance of the Civil War, but it was also used to ripen the climate for the National Currency Act of 1863, which allowed for the creation of a national banking system. And then there was the National Bank Act of 1864, which required the banks to purchase government bonds, or rather indentures of servitude, which were literally oral or written contracts that stated that labor will be redeemed for these same legal tender notes. And although it is true that the Civil War required a substantial amount of money and credit for the manpower used, most importantly, someone needed for those wars to happen so that those monetary acts could take place. The creation of legal tender notes opened the doors wide to a monopoly and allowed for a small group of people to now have full control of the trade. This small group of people were known as bankers that eventually controlled everything from crops, land, products, and even the trade of people and the government. A legal tender note was the U.S. form of paper money from the years of 1862 to 1971, and many of these legal tender notes were backed by gold, and some of them weren't. That is why someone or some bodies thought it was necessary to replace them with Federal Reserve notes, starting in the year of 1933. The government made it illegal to own or hoard a certain amount of gold, which was of course more valuable than their legal tender notes across the world. And with Executive Order 6102 becoming law, all gold was called out of circulation, and anyone with gold was ordered to turn it into the Federal Reserve banks. Any persons not adhering to this order by law was subject to hefty fines or imprisonment, or both. Why was this so important to the government? Simply because of the difference between a legal tender note and a Federal Reserve note. One note represents a bill of credit for something received, which was a representation of the government's indebtedness towards the holder, and the other note represents a fiat currency, which is not backed by any physical commodity of silver or gold, making the government non-liable for its use or misrepresentation. This Federal Reserve note has been the main form of currency since the Executive Order 6102 was given in 1933, and it is also important to note that this presidential order stems from the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which gave the president power to oversee and restrict any and all trades between the United States and its so-called enemies in times of war. All of this falls back on the establishment of the credit and debit system and how the creation of credit scores affected the buying rights of people of color, still to this very day. So, this allowed the government to continue with printing paper money that was not backed by an equal amount of silver or gold. But wait a minute, if paper money is not backed by any previous commodity or any physical security, then what is it backed by? Nothing other than human capital.
The root is land. How much land do we own? Land, earth. Well, we were set free, so-called, in 1865. By 1910, the black people who were just set free owned 16 million acres of land in America. Then we built towns on the land that we own. We cut down the trees. We made homes. We were the people that built America for white people. But when freedom came, they didn't want us to be the only artisans, craftsmen, engineers.
We like to think about what's gone wrong in our country as a misunderstanding. You know, we have this dialectic of race relations. We need to heal the divide between the races. You know, as though this is somehow natural, as though it was something passive that just, you know, a miscommunication that just sort of happened. But in fact, what we see is policy after policy after policy of plunder, of taking things from black people and giving them to other people. The case for reparations rests on a really, really simple notion. What you have taken should be given back. It's quite simple. It's quite simple.
Some 2020 Democratic candidates are touting their support for reparations for slavery. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Julian Castro have all gotten on board with the idea. But before we all jump on the bandwagon, let's take a look at what the actual cost could be using those Pickford payouts to black farmers under the Obama administration. Of course, they were discriminated against by the USDA. Each were given $50,000. It was awarded to over 33,000 farmers or their heirs. So if we apply that same model right now to every black American and people of multicultural who say they have black descendants, then we're talking about $2.5 trillion. 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 We're talking about $2.5 trillion.
Continuing where we left off during the second part of this segment, we begin with sharing more details on how this system was designed to benefit only 1% of the people. These ideas of colonization were originally experimented on other people outside of the Americas and carried over to these lands with a more desperate need to succeed at monopolizing an already existing form of trade here. It was said that whoever controls the trade controls the land, and with the creation of currency, the use of shares, stocks, and bonds, along with the implementation of economics and exchange, the Negro farmers would soon lose control of the trade here in the U.S., and subsequently, they also lost control over their lands with the help of the banks. A bank is defined as a retail or commercial financial institution that is licensed by the government to receive and loan money. The word bank derives from the old Italian word banca and then the Middle French word ben banque, in which both words are defined as a table, which is why the etymology of the word bank is defined as a money lender's exchange table or a money box. The term money box was the obsolete sense of the original meaning for the word stock, which also meant a subscribed capital of a corporation. In other words, stock was the term used to describe the movable property of a farm. Now, some of you may feel as though this is in regards to the animals on the farm, like livestock, for example, but unfortunately, it also holds true to the other movable objects on the farm as well, like those that work on the farm, who were also labeled as stock and kept account of. To be kept in stock meant to be kept in possession of a trader or to be imprisoned, prisoners of war. And here's why. Paper currency had oftentimes been hard to come by during its earlier days of existence, due to the bartering system being widely recognized. Many of the Negro farmers were making purchases literally off of promises, and because certain crops only came once a year, there was a credit system that was used to where things could be purchased all year round, and the money would be paid through the sale of the crop when it was ready to be purchased. Whenever the crop received was lower than expected, or if it was sold for less than it should have been, the farmer would then fall behind on his or her credit, and this invincible amount of currency owed would be tacked onto next year's amount due. After so many times of this happening, the Negro farmers will be then forced to either get a loan or to sell their farm. What is also very important to note is that in the 1860s was something called the crop lien system, where the farmer would sign over the deed to their farm and still be able to work on the farm to pay it off. However, with the rise of taxes, transportation costs, and storage fees, etc., this became very difficult to do so, which eventually led to foreclosure, allowing for the banks to now own our ancestors' lands. With the Preemption Act of 1841 already set in stone, the tenant farmers that were squatting on the farms and sharecropping with the Negro farmers were given first dibs on purchasing the lands, and in many cases, for free. Now, some of you may feel as though this sounds like a fair deal, but what if I told you that these same tenant farmers were already expecting for things to happen the way they did? After being in office for only 3 months as the Vice President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, a racist, bigoted Democrat, became the president immediately after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Johnson was also the military governor of the very first state to re-enter the Union after the Civil War, which was the state of Tennessee in the year of 1866. Now, according to whitehouse.gov, he used the state of Tennessee as a laboratory for Reconstruction. So it's no surprise that also in 1866, Johnson sent out a U.S. Department of Agriculture official named Oliver Hudson Kelley in order to survey the South and the agricultural industry. as it was right after the Civil War. And after this survey, Oliver Hudson Kelley responded with the creation of a secret society, very similar to the Masons, but this secret society was formed off of the industry of agriculture. So, with the help of 5 politicians and a banker, Oliver Kelley founded the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry in 1867. Grange is an old French word that means granary, barn, or farm, and the term husbandry is defined as someone that manages the conservation of resources, which meant that they were fully intending to take ownership of these farms from the creation of this society. Side note, the etymology of the word bond defines it as a husbandman or householder. The National Grange movement that was said to have been created in order to increase farm profits for farmers, unite Southern and Northern farmers, create co-ops for farmers, and to modernize farming practices. But the Negro farmers were banned from joining this movement. The National Grange supported the efforts of politicians and advanced several political candidates that were a part of the Greenback Party that allegedly carried an anti-monopoly ideology. The movement encouraged the distribution of greenbacks and worked diligently in order to remove the middleman out of the farming industry, who were the Negro farmers, by playing a key role with the establishment of the farm credit system. In the year 1916, then President Woodrow Wilson and his administration established what is called the FLB, also known as the Federal Land Bank, which is a system of banks that aided farmers in rural communities. Rural is another way of saying open space or open land or country. President Woodrow Wilson's main focus was to enforce a new era in business upon all business entities throughout North America by making drastic changes to the economy by federalizing all operations concerning the trade. The Federal Land Bank consisted of a total of 13 banks, not 12. Listen closely. Originally, before the Confederate States separated from the Union, the foreigners called these lands the 13 colonies, and soon after these rural areas were sectioned off and underlined as estates, various laws were passed, allowing each estate to have jurisdiction over their government-appointed district. Each Federal Reserve District had its own Federal Reserve Bank, and at the time of its inception, there was a grand total of 13 districts, making it a grand total of 13 banks. So, who was this 13th district that somehow people would overlook? It is the stateless area known today as the District of Columbia, under strict control of the U.S. Congress. More about this in another segment, but I mentioned all of this for a very particular reason. On December 23rd, 1913, 3 years prior to the creation of the FLB, President Wilson signed the Owen Glass Federal Reserve Act, or rather known as the Currency Bill, into law. This allowed for all major European powers to develop centralized control over all banks in the United States and forced only one form of currency to be lawful, which was the Federal Reserve Note. This was a much more modified version of the original Currency Act of September 1st, 1764. This means that all banks in the United States were now controlled by foreign entities, and these foreign entities were rather known as private banks. And these private banks collected interest on monies borrowed, or rather floating debt, by the U.S. federal government. Taxes should ring a bell here. Now, I want you all to note that these foreign entities or private banks do not own any individual banks of the United States, but they do own, however, stock in those same banks or shares, and only member banks can hold those shares. According to the Federal Reserve public records, about 38% of the banks in the United States are members of the Federal Reserve, and due to the currency bill signed by Woodrow Wilson, member banks must purchase shares based on their size alone. So the biggest banks would have the most shares, which would be Citigroup, JP Morgan, and Bank of America. And the largest stockholders of the banks that own shares are Barclays, Capital Research and Management, AXA, Bank of America, Fidelity Management and Research, State Street Corporation, Lazard Asset Management, Morgan Stanley, James Dimon, and Sanford Wheel. As the process of converting all promissory notes to Federal Reserve notes were currently underway, President Woodrow Wilson was quoted stating the following while campaigning his new agenda. Banks all over the country hastened to enter the Federal Reserve System, encouraging even congressional leaders to enact a new banking system and currency reform. Also, during the year of 1916, another piece of the Banking and Currency Reform Plan was underway, which eventually merged the 13 Federal Reserve banks that made up the Federal Land Bank with other banks alike in service corporations. When the merge was completed, it became known as the Farm Credit System, a now fully government-sponsored enterprise, or GSE for short, that still operates as a network of banks that provides lending services to beginning farmers, rural home buyers, agricultural producers, and rural infrastructure providers today. In addition to all of that, they also provide loans or credit for the commercial aspects of rural land, banks within the Farm Credit Bank only, and deals with refinancing, restructuring, rebuilding, and the repurchase of rural real estate for personal use. Let's break down each branch of this farm credit system first. There are 9 farm credit system institution types, which are Agricultural Credit Association, Bank for Cooperatives, Farm Credit Bank, FCS Financial Assistance Corporation, Federal Intermediate Credit Bank, Federal Land Bank, Federal Land Bank Association, Federal Land Credit Association, and Production Credit Association. These institutions are direct lending associations affiliated with one of the 4 banks of the farm credit system, who are CoBank, AgFirst, AgriBank, and Texas. There are 6 service corporations performing duties under the farm credit system as well, who are the Farm Credit Foundations, Farm Credit Leasing Services Corporation, Federal Agricultural Mortgage Corporation, Federal Farm Credit Banks Funding Corporation, Advantis Incorporated, and Farm Credit Financial Partners Incorporated. This is just scratching the surface of who should be held responsible for the mistreatment of our ancestors, confiscation of our ancestors' lands, along with broken promises that were never upheld by those who created them. Another great example of how this capitalist society succeeded in popularizing industrialization for one's loss and another one's gain is America's most highly favored board game, called Monopoly. On January 5th, 1904, a board game called the Landlord's Game was patented under inventor Lizzie J. Magie, also known as Elizabeth Maggie Phillips, who was the hidden figure behind the idea of the Monopoly board game. As you may recall, that each time this game is played with your family or friends, things would take a turn for the worst near the conclusion of the game. Arguments, long periods of not speaking with each other, possible relationship separations, and so forth, right? Well, that's all due to the fact that this board game was never meant to be a fun, family-friendly type of game. In fact, it's a game of reality, a reality of how this society was established from its inception. Fraud. In a 1936 magazine article of the Evening Star, Elizabeth Magie noted that the game was to be, quote, a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences, end quote. Author Ruth Hall wrote that the term land grabbing, quote, obscures vast differences in the legality, structure, and outcomes of commercial land deals, and deflects attention from the roles of domestic elites and governments as partners, intermediaries, and beneficiaries. According to the Webster's Dictionary, the noun land grab means, quote, a usually swift acquisition of property such as land or patent rights, often by fraud or force, end quote. This is not just some simple board game, as it does, however, expose the duplicities of a federal currency system and the malevolent implications of capital accumulation by taking land and building an empire from the labors of those who were cheated. Our ancestors. I'm just here to make you think.